And I think that that kind of positivity is well warranted for a world that we all live in where, we have constant uncertainty, constant, you know, polarization, and maybe not always that what can I do in my own communities. I hope that as people look to the things that they can change, that zoning, which takes place at the local level and arguably one of the most accessible yet inaccessible powers of local government with huge impacts. That's why I wrote this book. I wrote this book to arm people with information that they can use in their own communities.
Hey everyone, welcome to the Active Towns channel. My name is John Simmerman, and that is Sara Bronin, author of the new book, Key to the City. We're going to be talking about this new book, which is incredibly important, talking about the positive impact that zoning can have within our communities, and really emphasizing the fact that this is something that we can control at the local level. Let's get right to it with Sara. Sara Bronin, such a pleasure having you on the Active Towns podcast. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me, John.
Sara, I love giving my guests just a quick opportunity to introduce themselves. So who the heck is Sara?
Well, I am an architect and attorney. I'm from Houston, Texas. I live in DC. And I think probably my main job in life is to try to expose how land use rules affect our lives, connecting these very arcane legal concepts and documents to what we end up seeing and experiencing in our cities. So that cuts through various work that I do as a professor on the public service side, and more recently as a writer.
I love it. I love it. Yeah. So you just mentioned you are a writer, and we're here to talk about your brand new book. Yay, The Key to the City. I just finished reading it this week, and it was just so delightful to read this. And it's one of the things that I loved about the book, though, too, is that especially like in this world of like zoning and talking about zoning and what does all this mean? It seriously is the key to the city in so many different ways. And that's coming from a public health guy, so I've been in public health now for going on 35 years. And when we look at the built environment and how it encourages healthy living, physical activity is my area of emphasis in the built environment, and that interaction that takes place is at that nexus, that intersection of health and the built environment. But zoning also has a deep history in kind of where it came from was from public health. Talk a little bit about, what really compelled you to want to write this book.
Well, I think people deserve to understand how these zoning codes, which are adopted at the local level and govern virtually everything that gets built in this country, actually work in their communities. And it's really hard to access a zoning code normally because they might be 150 pages, they might be 3,800 pages, like the City of Boston's zoning code, and they are definitely filled with technical jargon and cross references, and they're extremely technical and dense. So what I wanted to do with this book was to take some of the things that we see across American zoning codes, no matter where they are, local, which jurisdiction or local government has adopted them, and say, for this kind of zoning provision, here are the things that might happen in real life in your community. And I really hope that by doing that, people will start to engage with zoning, they feel like they have an entry point into the conversations about zoning, and then hopefully change them for the better.
And I like the fact that you emphasize that, change them for the better, because one of the narratives that sometimes happens when it comes to zoning, and we can talk about zoning in several different ways. We can think about exclusionary single-family housing zoning. We can think about zoning. Getting back to the roots of how zoning really came about was separating out some of those uses that became toxic to the populace, hence the connection to public health. But what I love about how you kind of frame the book is that, no, let's just not throw zoning completely out. because that's not a solution either. And you have a personal relationship to that, having grown up in the Houston area.
So Houston is the only large American city without zoning, and you're right that in the book I start in chapter one talking about my childhood home and saying well, I visited where I used to live in my early years in the book, and right across from the apartment complex that I lived in was a gas station, a nightclub, a self storage facility, a strip mall, parking lot. These are not the kinds of things that make a great neighborhood, certainly not an active walking neighborhood. And yet they were sort of sprinkled all about right across the street. So it made me realize that when I was driving around Houston as a young kid, going, why does this look like this? And why isn't this more beautiful? And why do we have so many strip malls that, there might be a bigger story here? So I went to architecture school and law school and, really that opened my eyes to the importance of the rules of the game, and zoning is the most important. But I do think Houston presents a great, I think, argument for zoning, even though lots of people use Houston to say, why do we need zoning? The city still works. I guess I'm here to say, as someone from there, it doesn't really work that well.
Yeah. And that's what I love about the nuance of the book, because we do get into these arguments, especially with from the YIMBY movement of yes, in my backyard, let's try to build more housing and do it. Let's throw the zoning codes out and et cetera. Well, no, that's really not what we need to do. And I love that nuance in your book of saying, let's get it right. And oh, by the way, while we're getting it right, let's look at some of these other aspects of zoning and how that can apply to areas that you wouldn't necessarily even consider and think about. Like you have an entire chapter all about let's completing the street, and how zoning can be a part of that. And that's kind of the nexus of where this applies to active towns, because frequently I'm talking about zoning in the context of, hey, let's have more meaningful destinations within walking and biking and transit access and distances so that we can encourage more people to live a healthy, active lifestyle naturally and not have to quote unquote exercise or work out. It's like built into our life, which is exactly what we end up seeing, throughout Europe. I spend a lot of time in the Netherlands, and a very big part of the audience tuning in today is from the Netherlands. And that's one of the things that is quite natural there is the distances are such, and the mix of uses is such that you have many trips that you can do by walking and biking.
Yeah, as I point out in Key to the City, there is such a thing as too much mixing. So the Houston situation, anything goes, that doesn't work. you you have, though, an appropriate mix for neighborhoods. There's other office, perhaps retail stores sprinkled about. That makes for a much more convenient neighborhood. It encourages people to walk. I hesitate to, with so many of your viewers, listeners from the Netherlands, opine on any great American strategies for bike lanes. But I definitely do talk in the book about how zoning can be used to create more and better infrastructure for walking and biking, not so much and not as much for cars, which has been the thing that zoning codes have accommodated through things like minimum parking requirements, which require people to build parking on their lot, setting up a system that you're building, you're carving out space for cars in a way that you're not for people, for bikes, for walking, and more.
And you do talk about that in the book too, is that relationship to that other aspect of kind of zoning, and the relationship to what you just addressed was parking minimums. I've had Donald Shoup on before on the channel, and I'm slated to talk with him in a couple of weeks as well to do a reboot here on the YouTube channel. Talk a little bit about that side of it, because you do address it in the book as well.
So, Donald Shoup, the great professor who really, I think, articulately and convincingly has made the case for a generation of planners and policymakers that parking and the provision of parking and the mandates for parking have actually really ruined our cities. And you certainly see that it has been the case in Hartford, Connecticut, where I served for 7 years as chair of the Planning and Zoning Commission, and where the introduction to the book starts. But you see in Hartford a downtown that is covered in parking lots. You see our historic main streets. As those uses got converted to other uses, as the buildings got converted to other uses, it triggered minimum parking requirements. And so then the neighboring building got torn down. And instead of having just this nice little historic street, you have a street lined with curb cuts and parking, and in some neighborhoods, fast food and gas stations. And so parking has been not only, and zoning has used parking not only to reinforce the infrastructure of cars, but it's had negative environmental effects, because we've seen studies that say that the provision of parking encourages people to drive, so they drive more greenhouse gases, and we're paving over our cities with concrete. So all in all, not a great situation.
And it goes hand in hand. I mean, it's one of those things where if we sort of take the shackles that are preventing us from building the sort of the traditional neighborhood development pattern that we had when some of our more historic cities were built here in North America, and they were looking a little bit more European in nature. It's like, we, especially those that had that healthy mix, to your point, of the right type of mixed uses. You didn't have necessarily the tanneries and the other toxic, industries that were polluting the water and impacting health and well-being. Thinking down in Houston of looking at the chemical factories and the oil processing and things of creating massive pollution, air pollution and things that are affecting health like that. Those things aside, but when we did have our traditional development patterns before we had the advent of sort of these exclusionary zoning codes sort of taking off and being copied and paste city after city, state after state, and suddenly we're seeing that to your point, we're starting to codify and create auto dependency. We're starting to like spread things out and further, and especially post World War II, we're seeing, leaning into drive everywhere for everything because the distances are so great.
Yeah, you're talking about the minimum lot size that's really embedded across zoning codes around the country. And what those minimum lot sizes say is that you're going to build only a single family home, and you're going to build that on a 1 acre lot or a 2 acre lot. I have a project called the National Zoning Atlas that has shown around the country how much the zoning across the country has contributed to exactly that kind of sprawl that you just referred to. And the primary culprit is through the single family zone that has made those minimum acreage requirements across the board. In Connecticut, where we started that project, we found that 80% of residential land has a 1 acre minimum parking requirement, and 50% has a 2 acre minimum parking requirement. And that's more than a football field per house. So, there you see, that's a great map of Connecticut showing where single family housing is allowed in the state. And here's another statistic kind of speaking to the single use nature of our communities. This is 91% of the state. So anything that's purple in the zoning atlas is a hit. And you've selected here on the top left, single family housing. And if you look at the same map for apartments, so 4 or more units of housing, you can see it's barely purple. And that land there represents just 2% of land in the state. So you compare 91% of land allowing for single family housing on these huge lots, and you say 2% of land is allowing housing is allowing housing, multifamily housing. And you see exactly very clearly why at this scale, when you're able to compare jurisdictions like we can in the National Zoning Atlas, you're seeing that there's a reason why Connecticut has a housing shortage and rents are expensive. It's because we're not allowing the kind of construction that people need in order to live affordably and in order to access opportunity.
I'm glad you mentioned that, being able to live affordably, because one of the key challenges to household and home affordability is the fact that if you're sort of de facto committing yourself to having to drive everywhere for everything, suddenly you're getting stuck into a situation where you're not able to walk and bike and use transit to your meaningful destinations. You're supporting one, two, maybe three cars and car payments, and with the AAA, estimating in upwards of $10,000 to $12,000 annually per person per car. I mean, that really undermines affordability.
Totally agree. And I have to say that I take a lot of heart in the fact that young people today are saying, we're not even getting driver's licenses. We don't want to deal with this. A car is not freedom, like and streets are for people. There you go. A car is not freedom, as car manufacturers would have us believe. A car is a burden. It's a financial burden. It's, of course, an environmental burden. But yet, we are forced to have cars oftentimes because our communities are not built in ways that enable us to get around, and to access different neighborhoods, different things that you might have in a broader neighborhood or region. And that's a big problem. And zoning can play a bit of a role in that.
Yeah, yeah, and yeah, you noticed my coffee mug, "Streets are for people," and it's one of the declarative statements that I try to put out there about active towns is that streets really are for people. They've been around. Streets have been around for thousands of years. The car, as the sort of mobility technology interloper that showed up 120 years ago, sort of transformed what our city streets look like. And in the book, you even reference, Las Vegas and the Strip and the, and channel Chuck Marohn in talking about Stroads and the fact that we've sort of morphed into this concept of streets and roads, highways, and the Strode, which is that futon of transportation, where it's a mashup trying to act like a street, the platform for building wealth and prosperity and social interactions, with a highway transporting cars quickly and throughput level of service. And it's a disastrous combination. It's a dangerous combination, but to me, it also kills more vitality and vibrancy and economic prosperity than it helps, being able to drive everywhere for everything fast.
Yeah, so these fast moving stroads, they're called, or 4 lanes, 6 lanes, 8 lane roads that are not highways. They cut through places with buildings and in places where people might want to cross, but they make it virtually impossible for people to exist safely within the street right of way. It's a huge problem. One that, at least in Hartford, we tried to address with the zoning code that had a chapter on streets and street design that would, we hoped, enable future streets to actually respond to the needs of multiple users and not just cars.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because that was the most satisfying part of the book for me, obviously, being an active transportation guy. I was like, wait, really? They were able to include streets in the zoning codes. To tell us more. I mean, how does that happen? Because I've always kind of seen it as it being completely separate.
Well, this is the case that I make. It's a bit of a legal case described as an interesting anecdote. But if you look at the statutes, the state statutes that enable local governments to zone, there's one in every state, and it says, cities and towns can enact zoning, and they can do so for the general welfare, for safety and public health and whatever. It's a laundry list of things. They give local governments very broad powers to regulate land within the jurisdiction. In many cases where local roads are owned locally, where roads are privately owned, so we're not talking about state roads or federal highways, but in every other case, I make the argument that local governments should consider whether zoning might be a tool to enable for compatible designs that are compatible with the neighboring uses. So in the City of Hartford zoning code, Chapter 9 is about streetscapes. And we lay out a series of considerations. If you're in a commercial street, if you're in a residential neighborhood, what kinds of things does the city need to take care of and understand when it's redoing its own roads or when private developers are building roads? And we did see the positive effect of that chapter in one of the very few large subdivision developments that have happened in Hartford in recent years, where new streets were created and they had bike lanes and they had sort of nicely tucked away streetcars. And I'm really proud that in, again, one of the few opportunities that we've had to test that, because we don't build a lot of new roads in Hartford. We don't rehab at scale a lot of existing roads, that it did work to actually create a street that was for people.
Yeah, yeah. Now, I'm going to say this, and I don't mean to date you at all, but you did spend your undergraduate here in Austin at the University of Texas. At that time, was the Miller Mueller Airport operating, or had it already been shut down?
I believe it was undergoing the redevelopment planning process at that time.
Because it's been underway for about 20 years, and they are currently at about 90-95% built out. And what's really been, fascinating, especially documenting it over the last decade that I've been here in Austin, is just that, is like actually looking at a new community that's been built from the ground up, having the influence of the new urbanists, the Congress for New Urbanism. You kind of see it and feel it, and you're like, "Ooh, this is a really nice mix of missing middle housing, commercial districts that are blended in with housing." And to your point, they also had the opportunity to sort of codify an ongoing relationship, which has been in place for the last 12 years with the Dutch Cycling Embassy. And so they have an entire Dutch-inspired bicycle network that is growing up, from the ground up, literally from the tarmac, from what used to be runways up, throughout the community, connecting the brand new Marshall Middle School that's there, where they have protected bikeways, and even some of that classic Dutch red color in the intersections, being able to deliver people safely to their destinations, whatever that might be, the brand new skate park or the middle school, all the wonderful shopping. In fact, they even have a Kirby Lane now in Miller, which is really cool. So I see what you mean by it's so encouraging when you see a brand new community coming up and embracing that concept. Now, what I don't know is whether any of those streets were done because zoning kind of like helped empower that. I don't know.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, so in the case of the Mueller development, I believe it was a zoning overlay that happened there that enabled that development to happen pursuant to a plan, and it was, I think, more carefully thought out than, of course, most neighborhoods. And there you had a bit of a blank slate because it was an airport, a big municipal facility that ended up being able to be converted, and new streets built and new uses. And not many cities have that kind of opportunity, unfortunately. And I think from all that I've heard that it has worked well overall. It sounds like you think so too.
I think so too, yeah. And it's been very encouraging to see also how the developer Catellus has been like sort of very, very carefully evaluating how those streets are in the infrastructure that they're putting in, specifically like with the walking and biking infrastructure, to see how people are responding to them and how well that's serving as residents as well as people visiting the businesses there. And I've seen like improvements. For instance, many of the bike lanes that were originally being put in were just painted bike lanes. And then they quickly moved to, no, we need separation and we need some protection. So you started seeing flex posts go in and buffers. And then they're like, oh, this next phase, and you can like literally you can ride your bike down Zach Scott and see the different layers of through the years. You can literally ride through the years and see how it got better and better and better the closer to the Marshall Middle School there at the intersection of Zach Scott and Tilly. And you can be like, oh wow, this is amazing. This is I feel like I'm in Europe now with a completely concrete protected separated facility. And what's interesting too is that Catellus, as they're getting ready to hand the entire development over to the residents to then have their sort of management of it through the homeowners association and et cetera. They've gone back and fixed what was previously just lighter, quicker, cheaper materials and interim materials like flex posts, and then put in really best in class protection and concrete. And so it is very, very interesting to see that and satisfying to see that. Now, in your book, you also, go ahead. Yeah.
I was just going to say the other thing about that development is that the blocks are actually very small. And, that's something that we also laid out in the Hartford zoning code, establishing blocks, as well as in the new subdivision regulations we adopted. But I do think that block size has a lot to do with the feeling in a neighborhood of walkability. And so I just wanted to point that out. Also, just
I'm
to
glad
say,
you did. Yeah.
developers did what they did there because they knew there was a market for it. They developed much more densely than much of the rest of Austin because they knew there was a market for it. And I think, the zoning, the planned unit development that was that allowed that development to happen within the context of a larger master plan is something that more communities should try to figure out, like how do we address market demand? Because right now, the one size fits all approach to lots of American zoning is simply not doing that.
What I love too about that development is you've got a little bit of everything. If what you really want is a single family house on a single family's lot, boom, you can do that. If you want sort of almost like a brownstone sort of like feel, there's some of those as well, row houses, et cetera. If you want more of an apartment living condo, you got that. I mean, literally there's something there for everything. But what's really, really cool about it, and I was literally just there a few weeks ago filming, Dan Burden was in town. And so we took him out for a tour and I produced a video on that earlier this week. And what was really great was seeing his eyes light up when he realized, oh, this is all alley fed. You've got front yards and porches and everything's not cut up by multiple driveways and continuous driveway cuts. And so there's that sensibility that there's some walkability that's a little bit, as you mentioned, it's got gentle density. You feel like it's walkable. You can get to meaningful destinations within a walking distance and biking distance. And it just feels like it's also more sociable in the sense. Now, you're in the DC area, Georgetown, right?
Yes, I am.
Yeah, Georgetown area. I mean, for those of us here in the western side of the United States, so to speak, I'm originally from California. It's like we go to a place like Georgetown and we're like, oh my gosh, this is so amazing. I can walk forever. There's so many things, and it's part of it is a short blocks, and it's also many, many different houses and also corner stores and businesses and that mixed use that happens there. One of the things I wanted to talk about that I love that you highlighted in the book as well, which is street related, was Church Street in Burlington. You also sort of mentioned Pearl Street from Boulder. I lived in Boulder for a decade. And so that was sort of this concept of back in the 1970s, there were many streets that tried to go, quote unquote, pedestrianize. And talk a little bit about the context, though, of zoning and how Burlington really kind of did something a little special that really, I think, is part of what they're trying to do to improve it. Because the irony is there, and you talk about this in the book, is they also have a Pearl Street and it's not as nice as Church Street.
So yeah, so in Burlington, I talk about a visit that my family made about 6 years ago, I think now, and we started to walk around this pedestrianized area, Church Street, and then got to the end of that and really saw kind of like what I was describing in Hartford, maybe a little bit more desolate streetscape. Um, with parking lots and so on, compared to what we had just seen on this pedestrianized way, a successful, I think, pedestrianized mall is what they call it. And but little did I know that, at that very same time, there was a process underway in Burlington to actually to develop new design manuals for their streets. And what was interesting about what Burlington did is that they also integrated into the design manual green infrastructure. So essentially, stormwater management. That might be landscaping. In Burlington's case, it was basically setting aside space within the public right of way for tree wells, for rain gardens. And that's really smart because if you think about streets, they're the single biggest source of paving impervious coverage in our cities, and they contribute significantly to our ability to not manage stormwater. So in the era of increased precipitation, of rising waters, we definitely see that there is a need for jurisdictions to take a look at their streets. So I was glad to kind of connect our walk there in Burlington to some of the city processes that were underway. And I look forward to my next visit. I was there 2 years ago, and then I like to keep track to see how much of the city they've actually done. So
And to put this in context for the audience too, I mean, the location of this area of Burlington relative to Lake Champlain is part of what we're
very,
talking about. Yeah, because of the
yeah, and in
pollution.
fact, oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say the pollution effect, which is where I think you were going to go on that.
Yes. So the EPA had required the city to develop some kind of plan to manage the stormwater, which was running along these streets and picking up all of the contamination that streets have and dumping all of that into the lake. And obviously, this is problematic, but for a number of reasons. I mean, for the habitat, for aquatic life, for the city's ability to access from a recreation standpoint, maybe even from a drinking water standpoint, clean water. But the street redesign project was, I think, a very innovative and important response to that knowledge that the lake was polluted. And hopefully, again, over time, it might actually have a real effect of maintaining some of that polluted runoff within the city itself, allowing the new landscaping to process that.
Yeah. And one of the things that I've been seeing too recently in North America, and I've also documented this in Europe too, is the integration of building out more enhanced, more safe and inviting active mobility infrastructure, and then also integrating an opportunity for rain gardens and depaving efforts and using more permeable pavers to be able to soak up some of that. So not only are we trying to make it safer and more inviting and encourage people to participate in active mobility, a much more environmental friendly process, but then also looking at opportunities. Can we do some depaving strategically here and bring in some rain garden aspect and some greening aspect of it? You have an entire chapter to talk a bit about nature, and you channel a very special tree in your book. Why did you talk about this very special tree that you profiled in the book?
Well, just to say that the charter oak tree, which was in front of my house in Hartford, and there it is, in the city's, actually the country's oldest public park, Bushnell Park, and that's exactly the tree in the park, and it's next to the state capitol. So my where I write there looks out onto this tree. And it just reminded me really every day about the beauty of trees, the beauty of this specific tree, but also the environmental impacts. And if you squint, you can see a little sign there that is a sign during one of the tree commission's public relations weeks that talks about the benefits of the tree to the city in terms of cleaner air and so on. So that tree, I think, there's not that many huge, magnificent specimen trees in our cities today, but there are lots of ordinary trees. There's a lot of trees that make up a city's forest, and in my view, zoning codes can be harnessed to actually help to reinforce the forest that's there and actually create new forest. So things like requiring new development to have a certain number of street trees, a certain number of on-site trees, to require native or naturally occurring trees, to require a certain amount of green space as opposed to paving. All of these things are strategies that a zoning code can use to help to green a city. For Hartford, a city that has lost many of its urban trees, especially street trees, meaning trees that line a street, it's especially important to boost that. And we certainly did that through the zoning code.
Yeah. And this brings us back around to public health once again, because we know that having access to nature and green places is very good for health on a societal level as well as from an individual level, both long term in terms of chronic disease, but also just from a sense of well-being.
Certainly. And we've also seen, in addition to what you just said, studies that show that the existence of trees actually reduces crime, the incidence of crime in certain neighborhoods, because perhaps it provides that sense of calm. It provides a respite from the concrete that we see in too many of our cities. And in Key to the City, I really do try to make the point that zoning is one of the ways that we might actually create more beautiful cities, more delightful cities. And I think it's hard to argue that a tree-lined street isn't a potential part of that.
Yeah. Now, we mentioned earlier that you spent some time in Austin, and you actually were in Austin earlier this year for the YIMBY conference, and you did a little presentation about the zoning atlas and all of that. So I did want to pull up something that is near and dear to our hearts as we're looking at trying to make Congress Avenue a little more of a pleasant environment, a little less of a traffic sewer. This is actually being proposed by the City of Austin Transportation Public Works Department, and it's the possibility of reimagining what Congress Avenue could be and should be. And some of the images that we have on screen here are really leaning into the aspect, especially closer to the Capitol, where the number of motor vehicle trips decreases dramatically. There's just not very many motor vehicles actually driving through that space. Is reimagining whether it could be more of a pedestrian-friendly, bike-friendly, maybe even a pedestrian-only plaza-type park, or maybe a flex park, or it doesn't have to be, just 100%, bike and ped. From a zoning perspective, when I was reading that chapter on Burlington, and thinking about how many of the pedestrianized malls that we saw in the 1970s fail, it seems to me that it's incredibly important from a zoning perspective and what the surrounding buildings are doing and are allowed to do from a zoning perspective really matter a lot as to whether this becomes a successful street, a successful plaza. Any thoughts on that?
I think that is, so for Austin, so first of all, good job, Austin. I'm glad that Congress Avenue, which has been a bit of in some ways it has turned into a strode, especially south of the river. And I'm not sure that anybody had that in mind necessarily. But yet you see South Congress, and I don't know if this is extending to South Congress, being a place where people like to walk and, go to Guero's and go to the shops. And I think, its increased popularity as a destination, I hope has inspired, and I hope will actually support this project getting over the finish line.
Yeah, so this will be primarily from Cesar Chavez Street up to up to 7th, and then 7th to 11th. Will be the plaza area. But it is interesting, if we take a look at this existing versus proposed sort of delineation of what the quote unquote street is for, we can see that, as we start looking at the possibility of a proposed redesigned Congress Avenue, it starts to become more of a street for people.
Yeah, I mean, you look at what Mayor Hidalgo has done in Paris, and that might be what Austin is leaning towards here. I mean, these blocks from Cesar Chavez to 7th Street, a lot of those blocks are actually filled with office uses and office buildings. Not all of them, but there are going to be definite gaps in terms of the uses on the adjacent streets, and maybe the activation that you might see in an area that is actually more like South Congress, where you have more little shops and more sort of activities. So I'm just going back to your point about the uses that are on that align this new street design. It will be important to continue to take a look at those uses, because you don't want a situation where somebody will argue that the street redesign and this massive investment failed because people aren't using it. And could it be that people aren't using it because the land use hasn't been updated? And there is stuff. I know there's some shops and a couple of museum type places, but I do think that's something that the city needs to keep an eye on.
Yeah. Is there anything that we haven't talked about yet about the book that you'd really like to leave the Active Towns audience with?
Gosh, let's see. We talked about housing. We talked about transportation. We talked a bit about the environment, which I do think is an extremely important part of this. I think I want to go back to maybe your own background in public health, if that's okay. And just to speak to once more the public health implications of zoning. So we've talked a little bit about the driving aspect and the lack of walking. But in Key to the City, I also focus on Baltimore, a city that has seen is a post-industrial city, like lots of eastern, northeastern cities, and had huge swaths of its community devoted to manufacturing purposes. The same was true in Hartford, where along our entire river, like many cities along the Connecticut River and other great rivers in New England, had entirely industrial uses. And I do, want to recognize that part of the history of zoning is also the industrial uses located next to environmental justice communities, the industrial uses located next to rivers, cutting people off from that source of recreation and that access to nature. And these are legacy impacts of zoning, legacy impacts of the way cities developed. And that is another thing, especially that older cities need to take a look at. So I would put that on the list of things that are important implications of zoning that we might not have passed over. And similarly, too, there's a chapter 7 in the book about agriculture. So whether it's access to urban agriculture, so growing your own food, which is a healthy enterprise, or whether it's rural zoning that allows for commercial agricultural feeding operations, which are catastrophic in terms of public health for people living around them. That's an issue that we have not talked about enough in mainstream conversations about zoning. When zoning gets talked about, it's 100% of the time about housing. But connecting zoning to our food system, connecting zoning to these other site-specific effects, where neighbors suffer from pollution, post-industrial after effects, commercial agricultural feeding operations, and the pig farms and the stench and the runoff, and it's just really bad. those are things that we need to talk about more. So I'll put those little thoughts in your readers' minds and hope that they dig into the book and see how it does connect to public health.
Well, I love that you did have that chapter in there on agriculture. I actually grew up on a ranch in Northern California, about 2 miles outside of my little town of Lincoln, California, that at the time was only like 4,000 people. It was a very, very small town. But here in Austin, we try to grow our own food. We actually, have a little cottage, a little 700-foot 1946 cottage that's walking and biking distance to downtown. But we try to have our own little garden, and we try to grow our own food. And we had backyard chickens for the longest time as well. And so it just made me smile. And it's like, oh yeah, that's a big part of it too. And you're absolutely right. We don't even think about that is oftentimes included in those zoning areas. And it shouldn't be illegal to be able to grow your own food for yourself or your neighbors.
Yeah, and in the book, I use Boston as an example of a highly urbanized city that actually has some pretty great urban agriculture provisions. So for anyone who's interested in that, check out the book's journey into Boston.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I highly recommend everybody, pick up your own copy of Key to the City. I do have it out here on the Active Towns bookshop, and it's a fabulous read. I didn't find it at all, one of those dry books that you open up that's about zoning, and it also was very positive. I liked the fact because it also can get very negative very fast when we look at the historical context of zoning. I mean, we don't have to look very far here in Austin to see how zoning was used as a bludgeon of segregation and a really, really, negative aspect. So I really appreciated the fact that the book was so positive and gave some uplifting stories of what is possible.
And I think that kind of positivity is well warranted for a world that we all live in where, we have constant uncertainty, constant, polarization, and maybe not always that, what can I do in my own communities? I hope that as people look to the things that they can change, that zoning, which takes place at the local level and arguably one of the most accessible yet inaccessible powers of local government with huge impacts. That's why I wrote this book. I wrote this book to arm people with information that they can use in their own communities. And for people who want to do something out in the world, I hope it provides some guidance, some fortification, and maybe some hope that change is possible.
Yeah, yeah. And if you'll indulge me, I will actually read your final paragraph in the book. It says, to be sure, zoning is not the only tool that matters. History, time, wealth, geography, and countless other factors will shape how communities evolve and develop. But while good zoning is not sufficient, it is necessary. Most important, it is something that we control. And I think that is a wonderful way to end this, because it does give us that sense of this is something that we can control. This is something that we can do. So get involved, folks. Get a copy of the book. Get involved at the local level, because that's where zoning really is controlled, is at the local level. Sara, this has been such a joy and pleasure having you on the Active Towns podcast. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much for having me.
Hey, thank you all so much for tuning in. Hope you enjoyed this episode with Sara Bronin. And if you did, please give it a thumbs up, leave a comment down below, and share it with a friend. And if you haven't done so already, I'd be honored to have you subscribe to the channel. Just click on that subscription button down below and ring that notifications bell. And if you've been enjoying this content here on the Active Towns channel, please consider supporting my efforts. It's easy to do. Just navigate over to activetowns.org, click on the support tab at the top of the page, and there's several different options there, including becoming a Patreon supporter. Patrons do get early and ad-free access to all my video content. And hey, every little bit helps and is so very much appreciated. Again, thank you so much for tuning in. And until next time, this is John signing off by wishing you much activity, health, and happiness. Cheers.
And again, sending a huge thank you out to all my Active Towns ambassadors supporting the channel on Patreon, Buy Me a Coffee, YouTube Super Thanks, as well as making contributions to the nonprofit and purchasing things from the Active Towns store. Every little bit adds up and it's much appreciated. Thank you all so much.